to the Father, to God. There is nothing that is needed. We do not need to perform because the love is unconditional. And we are back with another remote episode while the family is traveling. You might hear some kids in the background, speaking of. But today's episode and reflection, it's kind of even doing these while traveling, it's almost at the border of obligation and indulgence, because I love the obligatory duty of doing these each day. But also, while traveling, I hate when tasks and to-do lists stack up. So, we actually just did an episode, I'm sure you could easily find it about 2 weeks ago, on the delineation between obligation and indulgence, how to separate the two. But speaking of separating the two, I've got some music here as well. Been playing a lot of music lately, releasing a lot of music, all under the last episode I talked about it, all under the name Open State, one word, openstatemusic.com, or you can find it on Instagram, OpenState, or Spotify, Apple Music, all of the places. Releasing a lot of music lately, and philosophy woven in. Actually, I combine philosophy and music at a residency in Venice Beach here in LA once a month. So people can come see that experience, and you can see that on Instagram. But see the info for that on Instagram. But today's reflection has very little to do with that. And it has much more to do with the dynamic between the Father and the Son, of within the story of the Prodigal Son. So Jesus was a teacher, phenomenal teacher. If philosophy is a love of wisdom, he shared that wisdom that he had. Walking and walking and walking and teaching. Sharing stories throughout Israel, and he actually would use parables quite often over and over again, the same parables. It's kind of like, you could think about it a little bit like, comedians. Comedians have closers, their most important stories or jokes that they'd put at the end, or their most hilarious stories that they'd put at the end. And that's their strongest joke, called the closer. Well, Christ's closer was the parable of the prodigal son, which didn't get its name until the Middle Ages, is when we started to call it the prodigal son. Lately, in the last decade, some great scholars and pastors have started to change the name to give much more emphasis on the other character in the story, the father, calling it the running father. Which I'll talk about in a second. But if you don't know the story, it's the story of two sons, one dutiful, one prodigal, which means wasteful. The prodigal son, the wasteful student, demands his inheritance early, before the father's even passed away. And he went and wasted it on food, wine, and women. And after a time of complete gluttony, waste, and living with pigs and slop, homeless because he was so profligate, he eventually realizes that he is better off going to be a servant in his father's home than continuing on his path of immense indulgence. he decides he's going to go back to his father and tell him that he's willing to be a servant just to have shelter, to rectify the relationship. And when he heads back, he's still a distance from the home, but his father sees him and runs toward him. The father drops what he's doing out in the fields and runs towards the prodigal son. The other son complains and says, "I've done everything. I've been dutiful." But the father can't understand that logic. You see, the father has run towards the prodigal son, has hugged him, kissed him, and told everyone, "We're going to have the biggest feast." Puts his best robes on his son, and the dutiful son complains, and the father can't understand the point the dutiful son is trying to make. You see, we are so caught, especially in the religious lens, not the philosophical lens, but the religious lens, caught in this trap of performance, thinking that love, belonging, home, that all of these require performance conditions. But the philosophical point Christ is making is that to the Father, to God, there is nothing that is needed. We do not need to perform because the love is unconditional. That is the very definition of the word. If you've seen unconditional love in this world, then that would make one of us. Because in this relative existence, that is exceedingly, exceedingly rare. It is so much more common for a parent to be quite conditional with their love. A family member, a sibling, a spouse. You're in their good graces now, but do 5, 10, 15 things in a row that are atrocious, egregious by their standards, and you'll be able to see if that love is unconditional. But this parable, which is not meant to be taken literally, it's meant to be a parable, a story, a reflection that if Christ had 20 minutes with a crowd, he was not delivering sermons each week on a pulpit. We have one sermon in the Bible from him, Sermon on the Mount. A few discourses that you could try to say was a sermon, but in terms of gathering a crowd, it was very rare to see him speak. And if you had the chance, he made sure to impart the most impactful wisdom he could. To where you didn't need to learn 158 stories in the Bible to understand the philosophy that he was teaching. You might just get 20 minutes and a beautiful closer. The symbolic representation of not just God's love, but what our reunion with God is like, will be like, will always be like. It seems like every generation requires a scourging, a purifying of this tendency to make spirituality about conditions and performance. It's not about the prodigal son. The story is about the running father. The story isn't about action and wrong action and right action. The story is about turning in the right direction. That's today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. And that's a reflection that, if you heard once, with fresh ears, one that you could reflect on for decades and decades. Speaking of fatherhood, I've got to get back to dad duty right now. But we'll see you next time on the Daily Vedantic.